August 2025 began not with a natural disaster but with a shockwave of economic warfare. President Trump doubled tariffs on all Indian goods, 50% overnight. Markets from Mumbai to Gujarat reeled, as a simmering dispute became a global crisis. This wasn't just a US-India spat, it was a direct challenge to the global trade system. India faced a stark choice: capitulate or confront. The world held its breath. The next move belonged to India. The White House claimed the tariffs were punishment for India's continued purchase of Russian oil, arguing it fueled Russia's war machine. But many saw this as a pretext. India had bought Russian oil for years, so why act now? The real answer lay in geopolitics. India was caught in a US campaign to pressure China and assert dominance in Asia. Economist Jeffrey Sachs argued India had fallen into a US trap, becoming a pawn in a larger game. The US wanted to send a message to any country defying American interests. Yet, other nations, China, Turkey, even some US allies, also bought Russian oil, but weren't hit with such harsh tariffs. India was being singled out, raising accusations of double standards. The Indian Foreign Ministry called the move unfair and unreasonable, highlighting the hypocrisy. The official justification about Russian oil seemed thin. The real motives were deeper. Long-standing trade disputes over market access and agricultural policy were at the heart of the conflict. The oil issue was just the spark. The US framed the trade war in moral terms, but for India, it was about sovereignty and economic independence. The timing was strategic, not principled. The tariffs were a power play, using Russian oil as a convenient excuse. The real fight was over who would set the rules for the world's fastest-growing economies. India's refusal to align with US policy became the trigger for a much bigger confrontation. The world saw through the rhetoric. This was about reshaping the US-India trade relationship on American terms. Russian oil was just the justification. The stakes were much higher. India's response was swift and defiant. Prime Minister Modi addressed the nation declaring India was ready to pay a heavy price to protect its interests. He made it clear: protecting Indian farmers and trade policies was non-negotiable. The message was for both Washington and the Indian public. India would not bow to US pressure. The government prepared the country for a tough economic struggle, framing it as a matter of sovereignty. The Foreign Ministry condemned the tariffs, calling out US double standards. Why punish India while sparing other Russian oil buyers? The question exposed the move's unfairness. India rejected key US demands, especially on opening its markets to American farm and dairy products and accepting GM crops. These were red lines for India given the massive agricultural sector and public opposition to GMOs. Modi's stance was a direct answer. India would not sacrifice its farmers or food safety. The government framed the conflict as a battle for self-respect and national dignity. India was no longer a passive player on the world stage. The era of capitulation was over. India was ready for a long fight. The world took notice. The confrontation had just begun. The US-India trade war quickly drew in other global powers. In a rare move, China publicly supported India, urging resistance to US tariffs. Despite their own tensions, Beijing and New Delhi found common ground against American economic pressure. China's ambassador called Trump's tariffs a violation of international rules. Russia, too, condemned the US move, calling it illegal and unfair. Both nations saw the tariffs as part of a broader pattern of US economic bullying. Their support gave India diplomatic cover and signaled a shift in global alignments. The conflict was no longer just bilateral, it became a flashpoint in great power competition. President Xi Jinping warned the US against a mutually destructive war, highlighting the global stakes. The US hoped to isolate India, but instead pushed it closer to China and Russia. India was cautious about alliances, but the shared opposition created new cooperation. The trade war was now entangled with 21st century geopolitics. The world watched to see if this dispute would reshape alliances. The stakes had grown far beyond tariffs. A new global fault line was emerging. The 50% tariffs hit India's largest export market, worth $87 billion, like a sledgehammer. Over half of Indian exports to the US faced sudden, massive price hikes. For thousands of businesses, this was a potential catastrophe. Sectors like textiles, marine products, leather, auto components, and even gems and jewelry were all at risk. The steel industry, already battered by previous U.S. tariffs, faced renewed threats. Factory owners worried about canceled orders and unsold inventory. The real pain would be felt by workers, millions in cities like Tirupur, Pune, Kanpur, and Kerala. Production slowdowns threatened jobs and livelihoods across the country. The economic war had a human cost, not just corporate losses. The Trump administration's goal was clear: inflict enough pain to force India's hand. The question was whether India's economy and political leadership could withstand the pressure. The fate of entire industries now hung in the balance. The tariffs turned India's economy into a battlefield. The stakes were not just economic, but social and political. The world watched as India braced for impact. The real conflict wasn't Russian oil, it was about deep-rooted trade disputes. The US had a clear list of demands, with agriculture at the top. Washington wanted India to open its markets to American farm and dairy products, threatening millions of small Indian farmers. Duty-free imports could devastate rural livelihoods, making this a political red line for India. Genetically modified crops were another sticking point. The US wanted India to approve GM food imports, but Indian farmers and consumers strongly opposed them. For India, these were issues of food safety and sovereignty, not just trade. The US saw Indian policies as protectionist. India saw them as essential for national interest. No Indian government could easily concede without massive backlash. These core disagreements explained the persistent tension. The tariffs were a weapon to force India's hand on these entrenched issues. The US wanted access to India's vast market on its own terms. India refused to sacrifice its farmers or food standards. The clash was about who sets the rules for global trade. The battle lines were drawn. The trade war ignited fierce debate within India. The government's defiance drew both support and criticism. Opposition leaders called for retaliatory tariffs, demanding India stand firm. Some accused Modi of being too close to the US in the past, blaming his diplomacy for the crisis. The Congress Party condemned American coercion and questioned the government's strategy. Public intellectuals labeled Trump's policy as imperialism on steroids, fueling anti-American sentiment. The issue became a matter of national dignity, not just economics. The debate highlighted India's complex choices: retaliate, negotiate, or reform. There was unity and defiance, but no consensus on the path forward. Should India risk escalation or seek a different solution? The government faced pressure from all sides: political, economic, and public. The trade war became a defining domestic issue. The nation's next steps were being hotly debated everywhere. As India faced the crisis, experts debated the best response. Some urged direct retaliation, matching US tariffs on American goods to show strength. This eye for an eye approach would satisfy public anger, but risk a damaging escalation. Others advised caution, arguing that Trump's tariff policy would ultimately backfire on the US. Strategic patience, they said, might force Washington to reconsider. A third path focused on long-term reform, lowering India's own tariffs and diversifying export markets. By becoming more competitive and less dependent on the US, India could build resilience. Experts urged Indian businesses to seek new opportunities in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. The goal: win the long-term war, not just the current battle. The outcome remained uncertain. Prolonged trade war or eventual resolution? The choices India made now would shape its future and its place in the world. The crisis was a test of economic strength and diplomatic skill. The world watched as India weighed retaliation, patience, and reform. The stakes were high, and the consequences would be profound. The next chapter in US-India relations was about to be written.